Hello and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to go over all of the books that I read in the month of March. I know it's a little bit late, but here it is nonetheless, so let's get into the video. So if this is your first time here, I'm going to run over my stats for March, and then we'll go ahead and talk about the individual books that I read. So starting off with the stats, I have my laptop here. That way I can go through my story graph. So if you see me looking to the left, that is why. And then we'll go over some other stats that I have here in my not so aesthetic journal. I'm not very good at keeping a creative and aesthetic journal. It's mostly just for tracking. I read a total of 13 books in the month of March, which I feel like is a reasonable amount of books to read. In January, I read over 20, I believe, and that was ludicrous. I think this is more accurate to my average reading. That comes out to a total of 5,160 pages. And in terms of mood, it looks like I was mainly reading books that are emotional, reflective, mysterious, dark, and tense. So in terms of pace, 77% of the books that I read are medium paced, and 23% of the books that I read in March were fast paced. There were 2 books that I read that were over 500 pages, which comes out to about 15%. Then I read 3 books that were under 300 pages, which is 23%. And the majority of the books that I read were between 300 and 499 pages, which is 62% and comes out to 8 total books. So 85% of the books that I read, or 11 books, were fiction. And I did read 2 nonfiction books in March. And my goal is to read at least 1 a month, so haha, I'm tracking. Now in terms of genre, it looks like fantasy and contemporary were my top genres. Storygraph actually lists LGBTQIA+ as a genre, which confuses me because you can have fantasy books with LGBTQ representation, romance books, etc. So I don't consider it a genre. It's more of a component within a book. So I read 3 books that were considered LGBTQIA+. Yeah, I'm not sure whether to consider it a genre or not. Question for you, I guess. Do you consider LGBTQIA+ books a genre? I'm just curious. My average rating was 3.96 stars, with a total of 3 books that I rated 5 stars, 3 books that I rated 4.5 stars, 3 books that I rated 4 stars, 1 book that I rated 3.5, 2 books that I rated 3 stars, and then 1 book that I rated 1.5. And I also did have 1 DNF this month, or not this month, in the month of March. So now switching over to the stats in my reading journal. Out of the 13 books that I read, 6 of them were advanced reader copies through NetGalley. 5 of them were borrowed books through my library, and 2 of them came from my physical TBR. In terms of format, 8 of the books that I read were audiobooks, which is more than half of the books. 4 of them were ebooks, which means I only read 1 physical book. There's just been a larger trend of me consuming books via audio. I wonder why that is. I'm pretty sure it's because I can't sit down and relax with the book. Like, I feel like I have to be productive, which is a whole other different conversation. I reread 0 books this month yet again. It's the 3rd month in a row. What can I tell you? I read 0 translated works this month, which is sad. 7 of the books that I read were written by women or non-men. 5 of the books that I read were written by Latinx authors, and 1 book out of the 13 books that I read was written by a Black author. And I think that's an area that I can honestly just continue to improve on. Now, in terms of new to me authors, 7 of the books that I read were new to me authors, and the other 6 were authors that I previously read from. I did continue with 1 series, which is the one that I've been reading. It's A Song of Ice and Fire. I did read A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin and gave it 4 stars. And this month I am reading A Storm of Swords. So I'm planning to finish the series off with the readathon that is going on here on YouTube. But I did actually start 1 series, and this is Paradise 1 by David Wellington. It's a science fiction series. I actually didn't realize it was a series when I started it. I just read something by David Wellington before, quite enjoyed it, and I was in a mood for like a sci-fi thriller. I saw it was available as an audiobook on NetGalley, and I requested it, and I ended up enjoying it quite a bit. I did give it 3 stars, and it wasn't until after I finished it that I realized that it's part of a series, first of all, because it ended in the most abrupt, cliffhangery way, and I don't love that. So I don't mind cliffhangers, but when you end a book in such an abrupt way, it was just so confusing. Like, I had to go back to the app and figure out what was going on because there was no way that the book ended that way. But in fact, it did. It almost felt like the book was a lot longer and then they decided, oh, it's too long, let's cut it here. And this book is already over 600 pages long. Although it didn't feel that way. Actually, I was very surprised when I looked up how many pages it was to find out it was that long because for me, it just flew by. That's how much fun I had reading it. It just made the time go by super quickly. So that is the one series that I started. My favorite book for this month, that was Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. It is a contemporary romance that focuses on an age gap romance. Our main character is separating from this person that she was seeing a long time who was mentally abusing her, and she's, sort of trying to find herself and get over that relationship while also learning to love herself and learning to find her own voice through all of the noise and the disapproval from her parent and her colleagues and all that stuff. Then her love interest, he's 10 years younger than her and he's the mayor of this very small town. He cares about people and about her. He respects boundaries. He communicates. And just watching that whole dynamic play out was so beautiful. It also made me cackle. It was just such a funny book, but also had really deep topics and handled them in such a sensitive way. Really, really, really enjoyed it. Probably one of my favorite romances of all time now. Highly recommend if you haven't picked up anything by Abby Jimenez. So my one DNF was House of Cotton by Monica Brashears. This is a horror book, and the reason that I DNF'd it is because it has a lot of my dog's behind you and she's scratching and moving the camera. Thanks, Mia. Now, the reason that I DNF'd it is because it had a lot of explicit sexual content, specifically some sexual violence, and that is a really big trigger for me. So about 15% in, I did have to DNF it. So I did already talk about quite a few of these books during my mid-month wrap-up, which I will link down below. So I'll just go ahead and list the book, tell you my star rating, and then if you want to hear more thoughts, go ahead and watch that video, and then near the end I'll go over the books that I didn't talk about during that video. So starting off with The House of Eve by Sadeqa Johnson, I gave this book 4.5 stars. It was really compelling, well written, and it follows 2 separate women whose lives intersect in 2 alternating timelines. It is a historical fiction novel, and if you like historical fiction and haven't checked out Sadeqa Johnson, highly recommend her books. The second book that I finished was A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin. This is part of a series, A Song of Ice and Fire, and I did give it 4 stars. It is more of a political fantasy, a lot of scheming, large cast of characters, etc. The third book that I ended up finishing is The Witch and the Vampire by Francesca Flores. This is a young adult fantasy book that centers a sapphic romance with elemental witches and magic and also vampires, which just sounds like the best premise in the world. I originally gave it 3 stars, but just thinking about how I gave Paradise 1 3 stars, I feel like The Witch and the Vampire for me was like a 2-star read now that I think about it. I enjoyed the plotline enough. There were just some problems with the execution, and it was definitely too long. If it actually hadn't been for the audiobook, I don't think I would have finished it, if I'm being honest. So I think that's more of a 2-star now that I think about it. The next book that I finished was a novella called Foster by Clare Keegan. This I read for a vlog that I made about reading books by Irish authors, if you want to check that out, and that was a 4-star read. My Apple Watch is telling me that I need to stand up now, so give me one moment. The next book that I ended up finishing is Lucha of the Night Forest by Tehlor K. Mejia. This is another young adult fantasy book that had such an interesting premise, but just failed in its execution in so many different ways. I ended up giving that book 1.5 stars. It's probably the biggest disappointing for me up to this point. I was really excited for it. It has a beautiful cover, and I'm just disappointed that it didn't work out for me. The next book that I ended up picking up is Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez. This was recently published April 11th, and I gave it 4.5 stars. It is another contemporary romance, and we actually follow the best friend of our main character in Part of Your World. Yours Truly in particular has a Latina main character right at the center, and she was well represented. I personally loved how real and complex she was as an individual. She didn't feel like a stereotype of a Latina character. She was her own self, and she's freaking funny, and the dynamic between her and her love interest was just, it was great. 4.5 stars. The next book that I ended up finishing is Panenka by Rónán Hession, which I gave 5 stars to. This was also a book that I read for the vlog that I made about reading books by Irish authors. And this book is about this guy named Panenka, which if you're a soccer fan, you know exactly what that means. Actually, if you're a soccer fan, highly recommend for you to read this. It doesn't solely focus on the soccer. It's a book about Panenka, this individual, and how his community, which is a community that is largely shaped by the soccer team that their city has, how this community impacts him and his life, and it was beautifully told, so highly recommend. Now, the last book that I talked about during my mid-month wrap-up was Wonderland by Jennifer Hillier, which I gave 4 stars to. This is a thriller, and it was originally published in 2015, but they just came out, or they're about to come out, with the audiobook, so I did request it as an ARC, and it was good. I liked it, I enjoyed it. I would say that the cover, the past cover, was very misleading because people thought it was going to be this very creepy book about a carnival, and there is an amusement park in the story, but it definitely leans more on the investigative side, those detective procedurals with some dark topics included in it. So although there are creepy moments in it, the creep factor is very low, I would say, but there's a lot of suspense if you're into that. So the next book that I ended up finishing in the month of March is Paradise 1 by David Wellington. I did touch on this book a little bit already. I picked it up because I enjoyed a book by this author previously, and I saw that he was coming out with a new book, so I thought, why not pick it up? So in this book, we're following 3 people primarily who are sent on this punitive mission to a far-off colony called Paradise 1. So our 3 main characters are Sasha, and she is a member of this Firewatch military force, and her mom actually resides in Paradise 1. At the beginning of the novel, she disobeys orders, so as sort of a punishment, she gets sent to check out the well-being of Paradise 1. Our second character in the book is called Dr. Lee Zhang, and he's a lone survivor of this bizarre plague on a station on one of Saturn's moon. Then the third person who is on board is our pilot, who has dreamed of being a pilot for a very long time until he learns that he may not have been placed on this ship for the right reasons. And then our fourth and final character is Rapscallion, who is this funny, self-aware robot. Reminded me a little bit of Murderbot. So we have these 4 characters on the ship, and when they're within reach of Paradise 1, they are being attacked by this unknown entity. And as they try to communicate with Paradise 1, they realize that all communications are not going through, and Paradise 1 is silent. And I can't really tell you any more about that. I will say it's a long book, but it doesn't feel long. I just ate it up. It's so fast paced that it flew right by, and that is what I love out of a sci-fi thriller. Just action packed. It was like bam, 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 bam. I will say that it does end on the worst cliffhanger of my life. Why you gotta do me like that, David Wellington? Why? The next book that I ended up finishing in the month of March is The Cuban Heiress by Chanel Cleeton. This was an advanced early copy that I received through NetGalley, and it was already published on April 11th of 2023. So The Cuban Heiress is a historical fiction novel, and it was a book that I definitely enjoyed. I gave it 4.5 stars. It was just a little bit different than what I expected. So the way that Chanel Cleeton writes is she wants to write about this one particular historical moment, and then she builds a story around it with characters that she reimagines. And it definitely felt like that towards the end of the book. Something I can't really talk about it without spoilers, but something happens, which is this historical moment, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. It sort of almost felt very convenient that this happened, but nonetheless, the story was really well written. It was a story that just sucked me right in. I wanted to know what happened. So in this one, we're actually following two separate women who are on board of this ship called the Morro Castle that is traveling from New York to Cuba. Now, these two women are completely different. One of them is an heiress who is on board the ship with her fiance. They're going on a vacation. And then the second one is supposed to be dead, and she has this stolen identity. And we know that she's seeking revenge for something that happened to her in her past. Now, we don't know if these women know each other. We don't know if their paths intersect. We just know that they're here for very different reasons. And they each encounter two separate men that either help their cause or throw a wrench in it. I don't want to be very specific because I think this is such a great book to read by the poolside. It's so intriguing. The plot is amazing and it just sucked me right in. 4.5 stars. Really enjoyed it. The next book that I ended up reading is Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex by Angela Chen. This was really an introductory book for me about asexuality and the way that it intersects with feminism, sexual desire, attraction, and romantic and platonic relationships. I had a vague idea of what asexuality is or about people who identify as ace, but I never really thought about it in an intersectional lens and how that positions people in different power dynamics. So I would say that if you consider yourself a feminist, this is definitely a book that I think you should pick up because it talks a lot about feminism, but then also if you're exploring your sexuality or you want to learn more about asexuality, I think this was a great book to pick up as an introduction to the topic. It definitely goes a lot deeper into topics than I expected, which I personally really appreciated. And one other thing is that sometimes I feel like when people talk about more academic topics, some books can feel academic, but this has very accessible language to the point where it didn't feel like I was reading a nonfiction, which again, I always appreciate. Now, the last and final book that I ended up reading in the month of March was another nonfiction book. This is called The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness by Meghan O'Rourke. I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. One thing that I will say right off the bat is I really liked how self-aware Meghan O'Rourke is. She is a cis white woman who is moderately well off in terms of her finances and the resources that she can tap into. So she does talk about the privilege that she holds over so many other people who don't have those resources, that don't look like her. So that was really refreshing to see that she acknowledged her privilege and also talked about how that impacted or shaped the story that she is telling us. So in The Invisible Kingdom, Meghan O'Rourke walks us through her own experience and her battle with chronic illness and autoimmune diseases, and the ways in which the healthcare system is often set up against women or to not take women seriously. And she goes deeper into her own experiences of trying to find a specialist who even took her seriously enough to investigate after she started experiencing all of these disparate symptoms that people thought amounted to nothing. She also talks about her experiences with her family and her relationships and how her symptoms and her steadfast decision to not give up impacted those decisions, her work-life balance, her quality of life, and so on and so forth. Personally, for me, this was an introduction to chronic illness and to autoimmune diseases. I am someone who works in the healthcare system, and that's exactly the reason why I picked up this book. As someone who works in the healthcare system, I think it's important for me to educate myself with different topics surrounding health and other people's experiences. So I think this is a great introduction, and I'll definitely be seeking out more books that have more of an intersectional lens moving forward, specifically talking about autoimmune diseases and chronic illness. But yes, great introduction. Really enjoyed it. So those were all of the books that I ended up reading in the month of March. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you. And if you haven't subscribed, please go ahead and do so. That is one way that you can support me. Thank you, and I will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.